welcome to our first in, I hope, many interviews that we planned for this year. The idea is to talk to very interesting people, neuroscientists, and to ask them to actually step back and ask them big questions, or where things are going, what can we expect in the let's say neuroscience domain, but more narrowly, we won't hide it, things that are related with EEG. So I have great pleasure today of welcoming Professor Olav Krigolson, who is helping us, of course, understand brain processings behind learning and decision making. He's done some really interesting work with gambling and prediction. But he's also investigating, let's say, 21st century issues like fatigue and peak performance. He's a professor at University of Victoria, but also a visionary and an entrepreneur, as I understand from recently, right? And he's pushing EEG beyond science, let's say. So Olav, welcome, and thank you for agreeing to talk.
Welcome, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So you are a very interesting person. So you're working with both monks and astronauts, right?
We've definitely tested a range of participants over the years and gone to a bunch of interesting places.
Yeah, that's an understatement, but it's a good one. So as someone who's been around for long enough and who's been working with all kinds of equipment and all kinds of setups, can you tell me what prevented EEG from, let's say, coming out for all these decades, and what is changing recently, and how the scope looks like now?
Yeah, of course. When I started my PhD, EEG was this field where you had to get a very expensive amplifier, and then you had to get a massive expensive electrodes. And so there was a cost issue that was quite considerable. And then there was the expertise needed to use the equipment. In the early days when I was, like I said, PhD and a postdoc student, the company would just ship you the system in a box, and you had to figure it all out yourself. And I remember many frustrating hours as a PhD student just trying to get the thing to work and stream data. And so there's the expertise piece, and then there's just time, setup time. It would take us an hour to get a participant ready for an experiment that might take 2 hours. So that really limited the applications to really pure basic research questions in a lab, just because it was hard to collect data. And I remember a former colleague of mine when I was a PhD student who was trying to do this kind of setup with kids with ADHD. And it just was so hard because the kids are moving, they're touching the electrodes and all this stuff. So it just was really hard. And it's gotten a lot easier over the past, 20 years, I guess, since I started doing this stuff.
Yes, and I think that mobile EEG that you also work with didn't exist before. So how did it come to existence, and why now?
Yeah, it's a good question. Mobile EEG didn't really exist. There were some early attempts, and I won't name names, but they were basically taking a lab-based system and outside and then putting a laptop in the backpack and trying to basically replicate a lab out in the world with some interesting success. But the next breakthrough were systems that were truly mobile. And a good example here in Muse was here in Canada is the Muse, made by Interaxon. So when we first got our hands on the Muse, we looked at it and went, there's no way this thing measures EEG, right? Not at the price point it's at. And I remember when we collected our data and we published a paper back in 2017 on this, we were quite happily surprised to see it was getting decent quality EEG. Now, not the same as the large array systems, but good enough for some purposes. And that's just one of the companies that was out there. So they basically, people figured out a lot of the technical problems, and I'm not an engineer, but electrode quality is improved and the materials used have changed. In terms of building the chipsets and doing a lot on board, there's improvements there. So that opened the door for companies to start making, lower cost devices. And then there's the in-between. Cognionics is a great example of a company that makes a good decent enough mobile systems. Are good. They're much better than the Muse. They're on par actually most of the time with the Activisions, the brain vision systems. And there's just this spectra on the commercial side, especially now. There's a lot of companies that are selling low-cost headsets. NeuroSky, Emotive, Interaxon. So there's a sort of commercial aspect to it, which has opened the door for some things. And then there's other companies that are building really cool devices that are sort of in the in-between space, where the price is a lot lower than the big array system. The data quality is a lot better than the lower end commercial systems. So those also allow researchers to do some cool stuff.
All right. And if you had to name the, let's say, major issues still to be resolved, what would those be in your opinion?
It all depends. Probably the biggest one we struggle with is, there's data quality still is coming up. It's a lot better. Like a year, I see new mobile devices where the data quality is significantly better than previous iterations. Electrode location is a big one. For some of the mobile systems, they're sticking electrodes where they can stick them because of the way they want to deploy the system. And so that can be a limiting factor depending on what you're doing. And in specialty stuff, like we do a lot of stuff with event related potentials or ERPs. And then the Bluetooth timing issue becomes an issue. So a lot of these systems transmit their data over Bluetooth. And when you listen to music, you don't hear that because the way it's set up is to build a buffer and stream the data once there's enough data. When you're doing ERP work and research, that timing does reduce the signal quality. But Bluetooth is getting better every year. I'm sure people far smarter than me are working on solutions to resolve the timing issue.
Well, I was about to say that I have an event to recommend coming in April, but I wouldn't dare to say that people smarter than you are working on that. But on that on that note, indeed, I think that there is a lot of room for improvement, and the innovation is coming probably earlier than you expected. So stay tuned for that part.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people that just got into this space, and they're all smart people like you, and the other thing with EEG especially is that EEG was founded. I forget I think it was 1929 when Hans Berger first recorded the first signal. So we're almost at 100 years of EEG, and that body of knowledge has led to people learning things and improving things. Because a lot of people, if you're not in the research space, don't, the only time you hear about EEG is if you have to go to the hospital, right? And you don't realize that it's out there and people are working on this stuff everywhere. But there's a gaming company in California that just released an EEG headset that's designed to interact with video games. So there's a lot of cool ideas out there.
Yeah, I saw there was something, the EEG electrodes are in the occipital domain, right?
Yeah, and they're basically able to use some very simple psychophysics to predict where you're looking. And I think it's only left, middle, or right. But that's a first step. It's only going to get better from that.
Yeah. So I was about to ask you, let's say, a difficult question. So we all feel somehow that we are going from the research to application domain. But previous attempts from companies that let's say are only in consumer space were let's say not completely successful. Let's put it that way. This killer app, as they call it, was missing. And it's my feeling, as also someone who is in that space for almost 10 years, is that, the coolness factor was playing a big role in the beginning. Like, look at my brain, I can see something. But now, we heard all those stories and we are kind of hungry for applications. So what, in your opinion, will come as a first or the second killer app in the EEG domain?
That's a good question. If we switch back to Muse for a minute, they're in the mindfulness space and they're not the only company. But it's an interesting area, but I don't see it as completely widespread because not everyone does mindfulness. Sleep is one that's definitely growing, right? Like a lot of people are thinking about sleep because right now, if you've got sleep issues, you basically have to go to a hospital into a sleep lab to get your EEG, recorded correctly. So sleep is an area. I think gaming will be a big one. If there's ways to, like, you could imagine a sports game where if you're paying more attention, your pass is more accurate, right? And if your mind's wandering a bit, it's less accurate. And the cool thing is gaming companies have the money to throw at this stuff, and probably have the health sector. There's some of the work we've done has definitely been pointed at that. So thinking of potential health applications, because you're right, when mobile came out, it was like, yes, these are my brain waves, and it was interesting, but then what do you do with it, right? Like, what is the thing? But if I was going to offer, and then one that we do a lot of work with in my lab is fatigue. So, if you could come up with a very quick way to assess fatigue. So we just published a paper just literally a couple of months ago where we were doing fatigue assessments in 7 minutes or less. And anywhere. We were doing them in the hospital emergency room. We were doing them in shopping malls. So that's a space where people might be interested. But you're right. The killer app is sort of there's a lot of headsets out there, and there's a lot of ideas. But what is the winning one that will take off?
Yeah. That's more than $1 million question. But the interesting point about fatigue that you mentioned is it's also a killer app should it work, because in many domains where you need, let's say, vigilant operators from flight control to other critical situations, railway or others, they would like to see kind of reliable fatigue tracking. So, in your opinion, can you track fatigue reliably based on only EEG?
Our data suggests you can. The question is, how reliable is it, right? So when we run machine learning classifiers, I think the best we've done so far is about 84% in terms of classifying someone as fatigued or not fatigued, which is good because chance is 50%. And if you do some research statistics, it's a highly significant effect. But the problem is if you're going to deploy it for airline pilots, you need to be 99.9% sure you're right. So I think it'll come as the systems improve. And the other breakthrough is, machine learning has been around for quite a long time, but I'd say it's pushing into EEG aggressively. But and there's changes there all the time. A good friend of mine, Callum Mathewson, just published a paper where they were able to detect stroke severity using a 3-minute mobile EEG recording, and their classification was, again, it wasn't 100%, but it's a step. So my hope is as the tech improves and as the software improves, then I think these become viable things.
And another tricky question related, in your opinion, in these, let's say, critical situations, is the attention or fatigue more relevant feature to track, let's say?
That's a good question. Well, I think they're both very interesting in the sense that there is tech out there right now. I always forget the name. of a company that they basically built EEG into a helmet or something, and you're supposed to wear it when you're driving big trucks and things. And I think that is more focused on when people aren't paying attention. So they're looking for, something that indicates that people aren't paying attention. The fatigue one is interesting as well. The medical example I gave you, there are tired doctors and nurses. And what we do know to be true is if you're a tired doctor or nurse, you are statistically more likely to make a mistake, and that could kill somebody, right? Literally. The attention one could have the same outcome though. If you're driving and you're completely not paying attention, you could kill someone. So I think they're both very interesting, and they're probably intertwined to some extent, because we know that, as you get more cognitively fatigued, your attention decreases and you mind wander more. So there's a linking there.
So how would you mentioned machine learning? Would you go further than that in defining fatigue or not?
Well, that if you're asking me my opinion, it could also be some kind of deep neural network. But those tech, like what we do horribly wrong with EEG right now is we collect this massive data set, multiple channels, sampling at high rates, and we just turn it into one or two numbers. So we reduce the dimensionality so much of the data because we have to we used to have to because of the statistics we normally use. And there's a lot more information in there. We know that. So the advantage to these machine learning techniques or the neural network techniques is you can put more information into, what's making it your decision as to right or wrong. And I think that is the key part, because, when we started doing this and started doing fatigue, we just picked one neural response. It's called a P300. It's an evoked response. And we tried to use that by itself as a determinant of fatigue. Well, we just did what I told you we shouldn't be doing, which is we took these massive data sets and turned it into one number, right? When what we're doing now is we're submitting multiple features. So it's not just the P300, it's the P300 amplitude, the P300 latency. We're doing some EEG things like the amount of alpha power that's over posterior sites. So what you're putting into your classifier is far more sophisticated than just trying to do it with a single number per person.
That's also very interesting. And in the P300 domain, it's like it used to be in school books regarding the blood pressure. You just got a number, and this was very unspecific. And then if you wanted to be person specific, then you had to have measured P300 or whatever in many situations to be able to say whether this person specific measure is changing or not. And usually we don't have that large data sets, if I'm not wrong.
Well, exactly. This is a mass. There's two things I'd say to that. I agree completely. And this is a problem I have with the way we do research. In fact, I was talking about it with my lab just the other day, which is, normally when you look at a published research study, you're comparing the average of one group to the average of the other group. And you're never looking at the individuals, right? Like you really never really focus on something. So in one of our hospital data, our fatigue hospital data sets, there's four at the start of the shift, because we usually measure them at the start of a shift and at the end of the shift. And there's 4 scores at the start of the shift that are the same as the people that are fatigued. Now, does that mean that they're fatigued at start, or does that mean that they just have a smaller P300 or whatever we used? So that's an interesting area to explore. The other thing too is this is why mobile EEG is, I think, so important, is it changes the sample size. Like, you can get big data, because our paper we just got published, I mentioned a while back, has a sample size of 1,000 participants. If you had have told me back when I was doing my PhD that you would have 1,000 people in an EEG study, I would have fallen over laughing and said, well, that'll take your whole career, right? Like you'll publish it the day you retire. We collected that data in a couple months. Probably could have collected it faster.
That's a true achievement, I would say, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of this research. And from our previous offline or online but not public talks, that we are focusing also on these hyperscanning studies where you simultaneously look how people behave when next to one another. This was also non-existent when just a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. But, one of our setups we use is we actually collect data from 16 people at the same time in a room, and they're all learning something. So we're trying to simulate a classroom. You couldn't have done that, that long ago, but with mobile headsets, it opens these doors, which I think is so cool. It's gonna change science, and that will lead to commercial applications, because you could imagine every kid in a classroom wearing a little thing that measures their brain waves to see if they're paying attention or whether they're struggling.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And just building on that question, you also are engaged in the work related to peak performance. So this is a very interesting domain to me personally. You could say that I'm in it, and I don't know the answers to my challenges, in the sense like how should we approach to peak performance. And we know that that we have some kind of clock within ourselves and that has cycles, and that we should somehow sync to these cycles, and that is the part we should optimize. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree completely. One of the studies we published, we basically were predicting baseball batting performance from EEG activity before they went out to bat. And yeah, we were able to do it. People that batted better had a different EEG pattern than people that batted worse. But if you want to do it really right, what you would do is you would capture someone, when they're performing well, and you'd capture someone when they're not performing well. And I mean the EEG pattern across the the head, and then that's where you get back to this machine learning idea, which is you build a classifier that can determine whether the current pattern is closer to A or B, good or bad, and then you can give people real time feedback. Like, you could imagine a businessman's about to walk into a really important meeting, and you're not performing near your peak, and the key part is, awareness allows intervention. It allows you to do something, go for a quick walk, do a mindfulness exercise, whatever it is that you need to do to get back to where you want to be. But I think peak performance would be a big one.
All right. When you have something, I'm all ears. So yeah. Finally, people will stop telling I'm lazy.
Yeah.
I wanna ask you a question about the dry EEG, which I sense is a crucial component of some future application space. So is it still a wet dream of EEG researchers, or something is moving there?
You know what? I find it depends on whether you talk to someone that's using dry EEG or not. You can get decent signal with a dry EEG system. I don't know enough about how the electrodes, I don't know enough about electrode technology. My guess is that, so the reality is currently if you add some gel to a dry system, you get, you can improve the signal quality. But there's two things I'd say to that. One is people are always doing materials research, right? And maybe there's a way to design those electrodes or build them in a way that you get the same data quality. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not an engineer, like I said. But the other thing too is the data quality good enough, right? Like, so for some of the applications we do, we just need the data quality to be good enough. It doesn't have to be the best data you need, because it's enough to get the results you want, or get the information you want. So there's a trade-off there, right? So when I hear these conversations, you can imagine the conservative classic EEG researcher with their 64 channel wet system, and they just frown on the dry electrode person. But the dry electrode person looks back and says, well, my setup time is 3 minutes and yours is an hour, right? So, it gets back to that, if the data quality is good enough, then on my mind, that's fine, because there's a lot of applications. If you think of our fatigue discussion, as long as the data is good enough to detect fatigue, then okay.
All right, so I understand we have a trade-off. We have data quality and setup time, and we are hitting the sweet spot there. But what about the form factor? Say that tomorrow you have consumer EEG. Where do you fit it in? Is it going to be something bulky on our head, or we are going to see some other form factors, and what?
Well, what's happening now is most of the so when I spoke at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas 2 years in a row, and the first year I think there was about 20 mobile EEG companies, and the second year, in 1 year, it was up to like over 40. So I don't even know all of them. There's companies everywhere building these things. What they currently do is they build the headset for two reasons in a configuration. One, for comfort, right? Because if it's uncomfortable, highly unlikely it'll be a good commercial product. And two, it's to get electrodes where they need them to accomplish their task. Because most of those companies are trying to measure something specific, so they're sticking electrodes where they can to get it. The video game company we talked about is a good example, where they had to cram their electrodes over the back of the head because that's what they needed to get their application to work. With the Muse, they tuck them on the forehead and behind the ears because that's all you need to do mindfulness. But again, with form factor trade-offs, and that'll be the interesting one, is people are trying to crack that problem. But what is the form factor? Like, one of my favorites of all time was I thought I had them around here, but I guess I don't. Interaxon did a partnership with Smith, the sunglasses company, and they put an EEG system into a pair of sunglasses, and limited electrode locations, but that was a form factor that you could go anywhere with. Like I used to wear them walking around campus just because I could, and there's your brainwave streaming to your iPhone.
Yeah, that's another thing that that I wanted to touch base on. Okay, I'll admit I was hoping that when we talked about form factor, you would mention headphones, because we did something on that line.
I was actually going to, because as you know, one of the reasons we're chatting is because I'm really interested in your headphones. I think I've never actually tested myself, but I think for the applications we're intending, it's the work we do with the NASA Mars Habitat in Hawaii. I think the headphone form factor is brilliant. Like it's actually perfect, because we want to do auditory evoked signals, and the electrodes are where you want them to be. And I haven't worn a pair yet. Sadly, I will hopefully soon. But the data quality is good. So I think headphones is another good form factor.
Yeah, and another thing that I wanted to touch base on when you mentioned the iPhone is that piece of evolution that happened was definitely, at least from our perspective, related to developments in mobile networks. Because you have, all of a sudden you have a computer in your pocket, and this computer is connected to another piece of electronics, which can be EEG headset, and there your possibilities actually grow.
The tricky part there, if I may, and I'll give a quick poke at most of the commercial companies, is the research companies typically have an SDK that they're happy to share with you. And because they know you're going to build research applications. The commercial companies are a lot more hesitant to share their how you connect to their devices, because they don't want you building apps on their platform, right? They want their platform for themselves. So some companies do. It's not everybody, but that I agree with you. The power of these phones now is more than enough to collect a lot of data.
Yeah,
and do machine. Sorry, go.
Yeah, I personally think that there is a lot of space, and that companies should actually do that, because I think that the market is only opening up. in a way. And I think there is room for everyone. I honestly believe that.
Yeah. Well, with my hat on as someone that believes in open science and the rest of it, I think these companies should adopt the Apple perspective, which is or the Android perspective, which is here's our SDK and we get a cut of the money, right? And go build apps on our device because it will really help them sell more devices. But I also understand about why you might want to protect your trade secrets and you might want to build the apps yourself. I guess I'm kind of on the fence, but I like the open concept personally. Yeah. And it works for Apple. Think of how many apps there are. I remember when I got my first iPhone and there was literally 30 apps or something ridiculous. And now there's millions. And it's worked for Apple. People buy lots of iPhones because there's so many things they can do with them, and Android, of course, as well.
I couldn't agree more. One thing that I want to say now, which is not connected to that, but I don't want to forget it, is that you are one of the scientists who don't appreciate academics talk always. You speak clearly, and you believe that we should revolutionize the way we exchange scientific reporting to make it clear for everyone. And that brings me to the topic of your TED Talk on Saturday. So I'm personally very much looking forward to it, but maybe you want to share a few words and invite people to watch.
Yeah, certainly. I'm giving a talk for TED. It's called TEDx Bear Creek Park. It's tedxbearcreekpark.ca. Tickets are free. So if people want to listen in, you basically go to the website and get a ticket, which gets you a link to watch. My talk is sort of kind of a bit of what we've been talking about, because as it's probably clear, I think mobile EEG is going to change our world. Like I believe that more than anything else. So my talk's a bit about that, just selling that message a bit. And I talked about two of our studies. I talk about some of the work we did with fatigue assessment in a hospital, and I talk about the work we did on the Mars habitat in Hawaii. But the key message is mobile EEG is going to change the world.
This is the music to my ears, Olav, I have to say. I think this is a beautiful ending of our conversation today. I want to touch on one last thing, which is not EEG related, but it's related to science and big and small leaps. I don't know if I'm getting old or something, but I have a feeling that we grew impatient and that we want either instantaneous results, or we believe that it's big ideas that drive the world. But when you dive into science, you see that usually these are very, very small steps. So do you have something to add there, and how should we encourage future scientists joining the crew?
I'll sound like I'm on a high horse here relative to some of my academic peers, but we have to change the whole thing because it's broken. Right now, most of us work in a world where most people, even if they're not in academia here, publish or perish. So you're so busy trying to get papers out the door that you're not doing good science. In fact, I have a really good friend, who calls it the least publishable unit. It's the least amount of work you have to do to get a paper published. And this carries over into the way we give out grant funding. If you have a really great idea, that might not get you a grant because it needs to be very incremental and set up in a very specific way. So I think my opinion is the system is broken, and we got to encourage people to try for home runs, and we got to not worry about if they've published 10 papers in a year or 3. Because it's a massive problem, and it's a top-down problem. It's really at the highest level, and it goes all the way to the bottom. Because I tell my PhD students, well, if you don't publish, you're never going to get a job, right? So it's literally impacting it at the lowest level, and at the top level. Here in Canada, the way we hand out research funding is basically a publication count. The people that publish the most papers get the most money. And then there's even biases within science. Don't even get me started. I'd love to say I have a Science or Nature paper, but it's a club. you know, and if you don't have the right author on your paper, you have no hope of getting in those journals. Now, that people that work for those journals will probably take great offense, but it is true, whether people like to admit it or not. So I think science is broken currently, but this is where the commercialization and bringing in the private sector, I think, is going to help, because it brings a different mentality.
That was very insightful, and I really tend to agree. I think there is a lot of time wasted in all the grant applications that go nowhere, and I don't want to repeat your words, but you said it way better yourself. So I want to thank you once again. This was really a pleasure for me, and I want to wish you good luck, although I'm sure you will not need it on your TED Talk, and invite everyone again to listen to you. So my guest today was Professor Olav Krigolson, and I'm Ivan from MBT. So I wish you all a nice day, and Olav, please do.
Even thank you for having me so much. It's been a pleasure. Enjoyed the talk.
Likewise. Good luck. See you next time.
See you next time.